Hi, my name's Phil and welcome to LabourVision, where we take a look at Labour policy in comparison with the Tory equivalent. In this video, I'm going to take a look at presenting budgets, economic competence, because Labour are proposing an amendment to the King's Speech this week, which would prevent a future Liz Truss style mini-budget. The question is, will Tory MPs back it or reject it? So if we go back 14 months to the mini-budget statement presented by Kwasi Kwarteng, what ultimately was the problem? The tax cuts that were presented were dubious at a time when public spending is already too low and the economy was failing. But that's not what caused the gilt market to be thrown into chaos and, almost result in a run on the pound. The reason the Bank of England had to rush into action and why Liz Truss was eventually brought down is because the budget statement was unfunded. They hadn't explained how they were going to pay for these tax cuts. When governments present a budget or budget statement to Parliament, it is accompanied by an economic forecast from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. That forecast explains what is going to happen as a result of the policies being presented. Now, this is important for many people, including investors, because in buying gilts, which are bonds in our currency, they want to be confident that the yield that's promised will be paid, because this is not a given. If a country ends up raising less in taxes than it must spend, then there's a risk it defaults on paying out bond yields. This happens around the world. It hasn't happened for the UK, but it has happened for other countries. So when Kwarteng presented that mini budget last year, investors became concerned that the tax cuts being proposed weren't costed, meaning that in a few years' time, it may be that the borrowing would be so high as to be unsustainable. If you borrow to invest in infrastructure, then that leads to higher tax revenues a few years down the line because that investment is allowing your businesses to flourish. But despite some Tories claiming that tax cuts also lead to growth, investors, who are hardly Marxist agitators, know that this is complete rubbish. All they saw was unfunded tax cuts that would have to be paid for with borrowing, which would lead to difficulties in a future government being able to service the national debt in a few years' time, risking their dividends. As a result, gilts became a less attractive investment and there was a sudden sell-off. The resultant action needed to prevent a run on the pound effectively wiped out tens of billions. The vast majority of the public agree that this should probably not happen again. So with this in mind, Labour are proposing an amendment next week, which they are calling a fiscal lock. Part of the proposal is that the Office for Budgetary Responsibility will always be able to publish their economic assessments, whether the government want them to or not. The proposal would mean that the OBR will publish an impact assessment for any statement which proposes permanent changes to taxation or spending. So in other words, any budget statement at all, no matter how small or large. The question is, how will Conservative MPs react? As the Guardian article on it points out, because this is an amendment to the King's Speech, the Tories can't just ignore it. If the vote wins, it becomes an obligation. The government can't just scrap the entire King's Speech. It's absolutely essential to carry on with their legislative programme. Now, in a sense, you would think this should be a fairly uncontroversial amendment. Neither Rishi Sunak nor Jeremy Hunt want to make a budget statement without an OBR assessment anyway. So you may ask, well, what's the big deal? The public are in favour of it. Surely the Tories are in favour of it. Tory MPs can go just, sure, yeah, we've got no problem with this and vote it through. But there are a couple of issues for them. The first, of course, is that it reminds the public about the economic vandalism that the Tories caused last year. After all, why do we need this amendment? To prevent them doing so again. And second, Liz Truss and her supporters have their own little suggestions on offer next week. It is not the case that the Conservatives have learned their lesson from last year. There are significant numbers of Tory MPs publicly calling for Truss's ideas to be put back in place. In fact, Liz Truss is presenting her own alternative budget. They're still calling for unfunded tax cuts. Now it seems unlikely that Sunak and Hunt want to provide them, but the calls are there. There is a minority, but a significant minority of Tory MPs who think that Truss was essentially right to do what she did, even if she got the politics a little bit wrong. As a result, this proposal of Labour's could be something that splits the Conservative Party, something that Sunak has tried to avoid doing for the past year. The thinking is that if Sunak supports the amendment, then it acts to annoy the Liz Truss faction because he's siding with Labour against them. If Sunak whips MPs to vote against it, then he's basically telling the public that he can't be trusted to introduce a budget statement that might not in the future contain unfunded tax cuts and crash the pound and people's pension funds again. What Sunak cannot do is ignore this. This isn't like an opposition day motion which carries no legal weight. This is the King's speech. It has to be passed. It's considered a test of the government's legitimacy. Until the King's speech is passed by Parliament, along with any amendments that it accepts or rejects, the legislative programme for the new session cannot begin. So Labour are suggesting that Parliament should vote to prevent any future occurrence of the Liz Truss mini-budget disaster. Over the coming week, we're going to find out whether the Tories agree or not. But there we are. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for further content, including the live streams most days. And until next time, I'll see you later.